So yeah, it's been a couple days since this movie's come out, and a lot of things have already been said about this movie. But I needed a couple days to kind of get all my thoughts together because, oh my god, I may have seen the funniest movie of the year. This movie is so hilariously bad. This movie is shockingly bad. This movie is on par with some of the funniest superhero movies out there. I'm not talking about, superhero comedy and such, but like movies like Catwoman, movies like Batman and Robin. These movies are in line with Kraven the Hunter. Kraven the Hunter is so hilariously bad. And you're probably thinking it's like, well, what about, Madam Web and Morbius and such? The difference between a movie like Kraven the Hunter and movies like Madam Web and Morbius are the fact that at my screening, people were laughing, including me. Whereas Madam Web and Morbius, no one did. And when you're in a theater and like you're not engaged and you're not entertained and there's like no engagement whatsoever from you or the audience, that is just boring. But a movie like Kraven, who I saw this movie Thursday night, so it was like people who were actually really excited for this movie, and people were laughing. This movie is embarrassingly bad. This movie is hilariously bad. But this movie at the same time, it brings me so much joy because of how awful it is. How can I hate something that brings me so much joy, that makes me smile, as bad as this movie is? Let's dive into this movie. So Kraven the Hunter was directed by J.C. Shandor, and it stars Aaron Taylor Johnson, Russell Crowe, Ariana DeBose, a few other people are in this movie. And it's about Kraven. He's a hunter, and he's on a revenge plan, basically. That's basically the best way I can describe it, because the movie itself is so thinly written that I really can't go into depth with it. Not like the movie did to begin with. Now, when I heard about this movie, I wasn't really excited. Obviously, I have not been a fan of this whole universe where we take Sony's Spider-Man villains and kind of give them their own solo movies where they're anti-heroes and such, because they can't really use Spider-Man right now. And Kraven, I know this movie was delayed a full year, basically more than a year, and I was still not really looking forward to it. The trailers looked okay. J.C. Shandor is a capable enough director. But I was not really looking forward to it, again, because of the attachment to the other franchise and such. And again, when I saw this movie, it is so hilariously bad. It is so funny. So awkwardly funny. I honestly couldn't believe what I was watching at times. Now, before I dive into this movie, like how bad it is, and with potential spoilers, are there any fun moments in this movie? Are there any good moments in this movie? There are a couple action sequences that are okay. Like the first opening 8 minutes that you kind of saw on YouTube already probably. That's probably some of the best in the movie. It's like, okay, this movie is not going to be great, but that was at least fine enough. Just wait until you see the rest of the movie. It is watchable, but mainly because of how enjoyably bad it gets. Let's dive into it. Yeah, that's basically all my pros. Everything else about this movie sucks. Everything else about this movie is awful. God awful. The dialogue in this movie is atrocious. Basically, all Russell Crowe's character says is basically like, yeah, I'm strong like me. Be strong like me, unlike your mother or your brother or something like that. Something along the lines of like, okay, Russell Crowe, brief second. Don't do Russian accents anymore. Don't do Italian accents anymore. And don't sing anymore. Please stop. You're a good actor. Please stop embarrassing yourself. Aaron Taylor Johnson, all he says is, I'm a hunter, that's all I do, I hunt. The main bad guy, he just says the most basic bad guy things you can think of. And Ariana DeBose as well, who, she's a recent Oscar winner, has one of the worst nonsensical lines I've ever heard in a movie. At one point in the movie, she tells Aaron Taylor Johnson about her grandmother, about the fact that, the grandmother saved Aaron Taylor Johnson's character at one point. And she goes, my grandma died after that incident. I haven't seen her since. You haven't seen someone who died. Someone wrote that. Someone said it. Someone saw that in the dailies and approved that. And it was released to the general public. Why? The ADR in this movie, too, is also awful. It is terrible. It is on point with Madame Web. And it may actually be more egregious because this is after Madame Web. Like, Ariana DeBose's character, she says things that she's clearly not actually saying. And it's embarrassing. Like, she's like far enough away where it's like you can't even see like her lips move and such. But someone like me who's watched a bunch of movies, I'm looking at that moment, I'm like, she's clearly not saying that. And it gets worse. There's a scene in the climax where Aaron Taylor Johnson sees something falling. And he's basically standing like right where I am right now. And you can clearly see his lips are not moving when he's saying something. This is embarrassing. Who thought that after the Madame Web debacle, especially with the horrible ADR in that movie, that they would maybe fix the ADR for a movie like Kraven the Hunter? You had an additional year and a half to release this movie. And you didn't fix anything? Anything at all? But we'll talk about that. Meanwhile, the characters themselves are very, very thin. They are the thinnest characters I've ever seen in a movie. They only have one trope, and that's it. Hardly anything. Hardly anything. There is nothing interesting about these characters whatsoever. The bad guy, played by Alessandro Nivola, he's the most basic bad guy I have seen in a while. Yes, even worse than the villain from Madame Web. Even worse. The plot itself is also very thin. It is just the most basic revenge plot you could think of. And the movie doesn't really dive deep enough to make you care about why anything is happening in this movie. I don't care. Meanwhile, a lot of the effects in this movie are so unbelievable, they look embarrassingly bad. Again, this movie was delayed a full year, and they couldn't get these effects right. Like, a bunch of the wild animals that are being interacted with, they look awful. Really awful. Don't throw your actors in with wild animals and such, but make them look decent at least. Don't make it look embarrassing. The effects when Christopher Abbott's character, when he like moves around and such and he disappears and appears other places, it is so laughable. It is so hilarious. It is so damn funny because of how awful work looks and how basically there's like a sound that every time he moves. It's just ridiculous. There are also some really stupid moments involving visuals as well. Like, again, the transportation. There's one point where Kraven jumps, and it looks dumb. It looks really dumb. A scene where basically they capture his brother at one point, and Kraven literally jumps from a hotel. He's kind of bouncing around, looking all CGI-ish. And when you do see him up close running, it looks embarrassing. Like, I know people make fun of Tom Cruise because he runs a lot in his movies, but wait until you see Aaron Taylor Johnson in this movie. It is the most embarrassing run I've seen in a movie in a while. He's just like this throughout the entire scene. Like, oh my god. That is embarrassing. There's another scene where main villain, played by Alessandro Nivola, he basically is told some bad news. And all he does is just do this weird screech. And it lasts for a little bit, like maybe less than a minute, but it's still long enough to be noticeable. And it is just hilarious. But also, when he finally turns into the Rhino at the end of the movie, it looks so awful. It is embarrassingly bad. Just looking at these visuals and just seeing what he looks like as the Rhino fully. My God. My God. It is so goofy. But meanwhile, let's talk about the actors in this movie. Pretty much everyone in this movie is awful. Ariana DeBose and Russell Crowe are both Oscar winners, and they are awful in this movie. Ariana DeBose in particular, I think it's also because her character is, again, probably the least written of all the characters, as among all the characters in this movie. But she's acting like she doesn't even want to be there. Russell Crowe, embarrassing. Alessandro Nivola, just hilariously bad. Everyone is just so boring in this movie. There are also a lot of really questionable moments in this movie, too, where Christopher Abbott's character, he transports a lot. And again, the sound he makes when he transports and such, like, okay, there's this one scene where he's coming up and all these assassins are coming going after him, including the main character's henchmen. So he has his own Quicksilver scene in this moment. Like, and the only thing he actually does is that he turns the gun of the main henchman around before he goes to Alessandro Nivola's character and just says, hey, what's up? So what was the point of anything? What was the point of you having this Quicksilver scene? What was the point of him being assassins to kill him, basically? And also, why did you turn the gun around? Like, he didn't notice that the gun was turned around. He doesn't shoot it at any point. He doesn't even notice. What was the point of this scene? What was the point of anything? Meanwhile, there's a scene in a mafia club where Sergei's brother is performing and such. Now, if you think of a club that's kind of run by the mafia, what song do you think you would think of? That's right, Sign of the Times by Harry Styles. I'm not kidding. That's actually played. That's actually performed in this movie. The ending itself also just feels very forced and very bland. It's just kind of hoping for a sequel, maybe, where basically the brother's saying, hey, I have powers now too, basically, and if we meet again, you'll see and such. It's kind of boring. It's kind of dull. It comes out of nowhere, and after the box office for this weekend, for this movie, I don't think we're going to see that ever. I don't think we will. There are also so many pacing issues with this movie, too. There's basically, after the first, 8 minutes, the opening of Kraven, basically, it pretty much cuts to his origins. And that takes a while, 20 minutes, at least. And I thought, wasn't Aaron Taylor Johnson in this movie? What's going on here? Why are you doing this backstory? Oh, right, because a lot of these serious comic book movies have to do a backstory of when they were younger and such. Worked well for Batman Begins. When has it worked after that? Not really anywhere, unfortunately. It just feels like it takes forever. This movie is 2 hours and 7 minutes long, and it does feel like an eternity at times. And I just wanted this movie to just end. But then again, I was having fun. Why would I want a good time to end? But also, I want to talk about a couple other things. I feel like this movie took itself way, way, way too seriously. And I think when they try to do a movie like this and try to take themselves way too seriously, it just winds up failing. Clearly it didn't work with Morbius. It clearly didn't work with Madame Web. So why do they keep doing this? I don't understand. This movie is clearly one of the funniest movies we've seen. This movie's so funny because they try to take it as seriously as humanly possible. And also the R rating. Now I know a lot of people complain oh, Venom should be rated R. I'm one of those people who feel like Venom should have been rated R. And we've been seeing a lot of R-rated comic book movies in the last couple of years, Joker, Deadpool, and such. But honestly, this movie is pretty tame for an R-rated movie. They just say the F word more than once. Blood kind of spurts out. That's really it. Why was this movie rated R? Doesn't even feel like an R-rated movie in my opinion. But I don't understand why Sony thought this whole universe was a good idea. So you can't use Spider-Man. So let's take a rogues gallery of random Spider-Man villains and give them their own movie. I will give Venom a pass because, like, at least Venom, it kind of makes sense. But, like, why Morbius? Why Madam Web? Why Kraven the Hunter? Why? Just why? They wanted to retain the rights to their characters, so they make these god-awful movies to try to hold on to them, just in case they actually do make a Spider-Man movie. In case they actually say, hey, Tom Holland, why don't you come back and watch, why don't you come back into this, Spider-Man-less Spider-Man movie, so it's no longer a Spider-Man Spider-less movie. I don't understand. I don't understand, like, why they thought this whole universe was a good idea. This makes even less sense than the DCEU. If you want to talk about, like, the ranking of, like, comic book cinematic universes, this one is at the bottom. There are hardly any good movies in this universe. And even Venom and Venom 2 are, like, okay compared to what Kraven, Madam Web, and Morbius are like, but still, I don't understand, like, why Sony thought this was all just a good idea to begin with. Every single movie in this universe has just been underwhelming in some way. Whether they've been just kind of generic, or just shockingly boring, or in case like Kraven the Hunter, absolutely hilarious. I don't understand, like, why this whole franchise exists. I don't understand, like, why they tried to make this cinematic universe work. They wanted this to work without putting in any effort. At least Marvel was building up to things, and while people criticize Marvel now, I know I sure have, but there was at least an attempt to make something that was working. This one is just saying, let's hope this works, but let's not give a shit about what we're putting into it. I am just amazed by, like, what Sony's logic is behind any of these movies. They're terrible, they're boring, and it's sometimes absolutely hilarious, but for the wrong reasons. But Kraven the Hunter, aside from, like, a couple moments where it's like, okay, the action's fine, and it can be at least watchable, enjoyably bad at times, pretty much everything else about this movie sucks. The dialogue is awful. The characters are horribly written. The plot is so horrible. The effects are terrible. So many stupid and illogical, questionable moments. The ADR is awful. The acting is awful. The pacing is awful. It's so serious. The R rating is a joke for this movie. That's the best way to describe Kraven the Hunter. A joke. It is a movie that should not exist, but there's a part of me that's glad it exists because I had such a good time with this movie. I can only really recommend this as a so bad it's good movie. When it hits a streaming service, again, get a whole bunch of friends, just watch it. Just watch it and just laugh. Just have a good time. There's really nothing I can add to this movie that pretty much hasn't already been said, but I've already ranted for almost 20 minutes. This is going to be a weird rating because, like, as a movie on its own, without anything, this is a 0.5 out of 4 stars. Skip it. But as a movie that's so hilariously bad that you should watch at some point, it's a see it. It's definitely a see it. So, Kraven the Hunter. Did you see it? And how would you rank all these Sony Spider-Man-less movies? Comment down below. Subscribe to the channel. This is Pat. Stay safe.